Welcome everybody to Mohenraj and Rosenbaum Are Humans.
I'm Marianne Mohenraj.
And I'm Ben Rosenbaum.
We're happy to have you join us.
In a
So,
human way. Entirely human. Not at all suspiciously not human.
yeah, this wants to lead me off into a tangent because I just wrote a whole thing on Facebook about my ADHD, and it's making me think about what gets to count as human and not human. But we had a different plan for today. So today we were going to talk about teaching, writing, and in a variety of forms.
Yes. My
we have
proposed
news.
title for this episode is Lesson Planning.
Lesson planning, yeah. And because we have news, Ben and I are very excited. We don't know when you're going to hear this, but probably before it happens. So we're excited to announce that we're going to be teaching at Clarion West in 2023, week
Woohoo!
1. I don't know the dates for week 1 off the top of my head, but in the summer. So we'll be in Seattle. And Ben and I were both students at Clarion West. I went in 1997. Jesus. And I'm sorry,
like 2001.
2001. 1997 is 25 years ago. 25 years ago. So it always
the year Darius was born.
Yeah. So whenever I say that, I'm always like reminded that I've been writing for a very long time.
We are aged ominous glige.
It doesn't feel like 25 years. And so, so we're super excited to go back and teach. I've taught at Clarion San Diego before, 2009, I want to say, but never at Clarion West. So it'll be fun going back to the old stomping grounds.
The heartland.
Yeah. So, and
swamp from which we arose,
Yeah. So now they may have given us guidelines on what we're supposed to cover in week 1. I don't quite remember.
Well, that's what's quite interesting about it is. So I of course have since 2001, for the last 21 years, I have dreamed of returning to teach at Clarion. I mean, it's that it's that kind of, because there's this paradisical aspect where Clarion is this very exciting thing, and then you can't go back. You can never do it twice. It's one of the rules, right? You can never do Clarion again. So it's like you're fallen from Eden, except if you teach, then you can go back. It's the only way to get back. So anyway.
Wait, should we actually, before we dive into this, should
possibly say what it is?
Say what it is, yeah. So how would you describe Clarion?
So I think Clarion's a very interesting social historical phenomenon too, because there's a way in which the various genres of literature in the 20th, 21st century are sort of alternate histories of each other. Like they took, they were all one thing back in the 19th century, kinda. I mean, there were feuds and streams there, and there were the Brontes quarreling with Austen about delicate miniatures and windswept moors. But there's a way in which the professionalization of literature of I think the Academy, I think they're being I think when the Academy decided that things that were written in English were worthy of august consideration, not only things written in Latin and Greek, there was this bifurcation of high and low genres. And of course, there's also this mass, you have mass production. I mean, you had that in 19th century too, to some extent, but maybe the Western was the first thing that was the mass produced, 1 penny, and penny dreadfuls. Anyway, my point being, they all work differently. And one of the interesting, distinctive things about science fiction and fantasy is all of this volunteer activity and kind of quasi, it's not the Clarions. I guess the other Clarion was traditionally anchored in the Academy. And there are things I don't know, there's a James Gunn program, there's various little things, but they're not nowadays you could do an MFA in science fiction in various places, but there's a long period during the 20th century where that just didn't exist. If you went to the formal Academy, you were studying, literary fiction was the genre of the Academy, and the others had to sort of figure out their own thing. And so what's cool about...
I would say there were exceptions even then, right? You could write ghost stories in a traditional MFA program. Yeah. You could write magical realism. Rocket ships would have been hard, right? And wizards and dragons would have been hard.
This is my son's in the middle of writing his senior thesis about, and he's writing a science fiction story and sort of a critical essay to accompany it. So he's grappling with all these definitions of science fiction, which I thought was kind of interesting. And there's that content based, like, does it have a dragon? Does it have a
Mm-hmm.
ghost? And of course, that is like one way of looking at it. And if you look at it as like, if there's a ghost, it's fantasy, then sure, you could write fantasy stories. But another way of looking at it is that genres are traditions. So there are a bunch of works that are in response to each other and following
Mm-hmm.
on and whatever. And of course, there's never any, like, all the boundaries are blurry, and really they're just threads that interweave. But like, in a way, it's like the reason you could write ghost stories was not because they were like a little bit of fantasy is okay. It was because they considered the ghost story to be part of that tradition, right? Like, you were writing ghost stories in the manner of Henry James, not in the manner of Weird Tales, right? Like, it wasn't
Yeah.
like you could come and write you know what I mean? Like, it wasn't in those days that you could just write something that was in response to you know
I mean, it's
like bug-eyed monsters.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting, right? I mean, like you could do Shakespeare, right? And so you can do Midsummer
Sure.
Night's Dream with fairies and wizards, and or sorry,
Exactly.
The Tempest has wizards,
Right,
right?
that kind of makes my point. it was
And
it
so
was about
yeah,
what tradition it's in, right? It's about.
so I agree, but you know, in practical aspects, what would happen in the classroom a lot of the times is that I think teachers, professors would often have a kind of gut reaction to something with a wizard in it, right? And they weren't necessarily asking the question of like, is this in the tradition of the Tempest? Is this a response
Well,
to the
I think
Tempest?
that gut
They,
reaction is related to is it
yeah,
well, and it had to do with this anxiety and this policing, because in Shakespeare's day, of course, there was no such distinction. Nobody's worried about, there
mm-hmm,
wasn't any rule about what you could have, like,
yeah,
or even in the 19th century, even in Bronte, like, Jane Eyre is this sort of impeccably high,
mm-hmm,
I mean, well, in those days, probably maybe not high because it was full of passion as opposed to,
mm-hmm,
but it's certainly like, we would think of it as literary, but there's a magic thing that happened, or perhaps a miracle that happens in the middle of it. There's like
mm-hmm,
either divine intervention and or telepathy scene. Like, that's just, I don't. There wasn't those rules and the anxiety of policing them were this, I think, specifically 20th century response to, like, this importance of there being high and low. The where low genres were booming and making a lot of money,
mm-hmm.
but also the whole raison d'etre of high literature was partly that it wasn't low, right? And so
Right, yeah,
that
yeah,
professor,
sure,
it wasn't just a gut feeling. It wasn't just, I think nowadays, I think in the 21st century, a literary professor, nowadays those walls have begun to fall because, again, technology has
mm-hmm,
changed, structures have changed, and I think a literary professor who has a gut reaction against your bug-eyed alien story in a literary MFA feels a little apologetic and is likely to
mm-hmm,
say, well, I'm not the right reader for this story. This course isn't for that. Those are different concerns, but is sort of circumspect or apologetic in a way that
mm-hmm,
a professor in 1970 would probably not have been. So the professor in 1970 might at best have said, I think you need to really focus on character and other important literary virtues, because these things, this isn't what this course is for. And not unimaginably would have said, I don't want you writing trash in here. You know what I mean? I don't want you
mm-hmm.
writing this isn't for commercial schlock
Yeah,
fiction. You know, this is for
yeah,
great fiction.
right,
Anyway, that I think that very much informed the world in which I grew up with, this high-low divide, right?
mm-hmm.
Even though there were lots of people hungry to cross it even then. But anyway,
Back to
the
Clarion, which we still
back
haven't
to Clarion.
defined.
So what's interesting was that the science fiction created its own parallel structures, and
Mm-hmm.
they're interesting parallel structures because um, the so, okay, so I had a story published in McSweeney's, and there was a very literary magazine, and I went to this reading. There was a reading at a bookstore for that issue of McSweeney's, so I was like there with some McSweeney's authors reading the story. It was like a little joint reading, bit of a con thing. And after the reading, I was like, to the McSweeney's authors, I was like, all right, where are we going? Like as a science fiction guy, I'm like, so obviously we're going out for drinks after
Yeah,
or
yeah.
whatever. And they were like, oh, like it was an unexpected. They were like, oh, I guess we could. Which I don't want to overgeneralize from this experience, but I do feel like there's a way in which science fiction culture is so many science fiction writers are fans first before they become
Mm-hmm.
pros. And there's this notion in which there's this fun thing we're doing, and maybe we could see if we get paid for it. Where there's something recreational, there's something connected to,
Mm.
this fundamentally recreational pursuit that then perhaps you can make a profession of, in a way that I don't know if everybody in the literary world has that. I mean, I'm sure they were readers first and they love fiction, but
Yeah, but
not
I've spent a lot of
communally.
time in that world,
Yeah,
right? Because I did an MFA and a PhD. And having gone to places like AWP, which is a big academic conference,
sure.
if you went to a reading there, odds are you would actually probably go out afterwards, right? But you're at a con, right? So it has
Yeah,
the
yeah.
con context there. Other readings, I think it varied a lot. Like if you would be with your classmates, then
Hmm.
yes, right?
Sure.
Because again, there's a community aspect that's already built into we went to school
A
together, right?
class. Yeah.
Whereas if I do readings in Chicago all the time, and or pre-pandemic I did anyway,
Hmm.
and sometimes we do stuff afterwards and sometimes not, but people are often they're in a very different environment there because they are, they've got day jobs, they've got kids at home, they come into the city, they do their reading in the evening and they want to get back, right? So I'd
Yeah.
just be a little careful about like the
Well,
con
no, but
environment
I
is
think
different,
that's
right?
well, okay, but I think, but
You
I mean,
know,
it's an apples and oranges comparison because if I go read it,
yeah,
like, if I go to a science fiction reading, like, the one in the series in New York or whatever, I think the vibe is different because, and I'm not saying it's absolute, obviously it depends on the
yeah.
person, the context, whatever, but what I'm saying is that there's a way in which, like, it does very much seem like there's a job, and this is a serious matter. It's in the
Mm-hmm.
world of work and the world of, art, and we might find an opportunity to have fun. Like you might find a person you connect with and go
Mm-hmm.
have fun, but that would be fun sort of emerging out of a context that is basically serious. Whereas I feel like there's some way in which any science fiction thing there's a substrate of fun where it's like probably people are coming together for fun. I mean, most people. How many people go to? You mentioned AWP. How many people are going to AWP just for fun? They don't have any. They don't have any. They're not publishers. They're not
No, no.
editors.
Well,
They're not. They're
It's
just
not.
for fun.
It's no, but it's not for that. It's not even really. I'm not even
And
sure it's
and
open to
well,
that, right?
is
So
there one? Is there a literary convention that people do AWP style stuff?
yeah,
Except it's the
yeah,
fun
yeah.
one
There's well, not an academic
with just
convention, but
fans.
there's tons of lit festivals all over the place. Sure, there are masses
Okay,
of
but
them. Jaipur Lit Fest, Printers Row in Chicago. I mean, they're huge. But I would say one difference is they do tend to maintain the pro reader distinction,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Which fandom mostly
Right.
doesn't, right? So
Right.
that is a big
Anyway, that's
difference.
what there's a science fiction is distinctive in that the fans run it
Yeah,
in some
yeah,
sense, right? And the authors
sure.
are there. The default orientation of science fiction is that the fans are doing a thing and the authors are there as honored guests, right? Like authors
Well,
are invited to participate and help, but like
I would disagree. I think that
which are you
well,
objecting to, the honored or the guests?
I guests, right? I mean, I think in the old days, the authors often were also con runners and were
Sure, sure.
also
Oh
very
yeah, no.
involved with it. I feel like
Well,
that's
no.
actually something
You can
we've
have two
lost.
hats.
But I feel like that's something we've lost a little bit is that there was a
Mm,
sort of professionalization thing that happened in the genre and a
yeah.
division
Yeah.
that where authors started getting snooty about it, honestly. And,
No, I 100% agree.
and it,
But in the old days, but if an author is running a con, they have their con running hat on, right? So when they go down to sit table with the other fans to plan out what the con is, they don't get to say, "Oh, well, because I'm the author, I
no,
have
no,
slightly
no,
more
no,
authority."
no,
No, no,
yeah,
no. They are
definitely no.
100% a fan
The,
who also happens to be an author, right?
yeah, 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 sure,
And
sure.
clearly their authority in running the con comes from the fan part, not the author part. Nobody, if anything, they're probably on guard to like not try to
Sure.
not throw their weight around as an author when they're doing the fan thing, right? Like not be like speaking
It's
as an
interesting.
author.
Yeah, yeah. I guess I don't think about. I mean, I do a lot of this, right? Like I go to cons and I work
Sure.
reg desk or whatever. I try and like I don't do a ton of con running in advance because I don't have time, but like I help with programming and whatever.
Sure.
I don't know that I feel like I'm taking off my author hat when I do that, right? Like
Well,
sometimes they're
I'm not
calling
saying you're
on that expertise too,
sure,
right?
sure,
So
sure, sure. It's an expertise that you could have. Yeah,
yeah,
obviously, if you're running, yeah. I mean, I volunteered with readings. Obviously, I'm someone
yeah,
who does
right,
readings, hence an author. That makes sense that I would help with readings.
yeah, yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not saying you have to deny like bury your author self. I'm just saying that as opposed to somewhere which is organized on more professional lines, where
I know, but you're
the
making a distinction that I mean, I
well,
do
okay.
like there's
Anyway,
a ton of
maybe it's
readings in
blurred.
Chicago that are put
Sure.
on by the writers,
What
like they're, so
I'm just saying I'm more talking about the 20th century than now. I'm talking about we're trying to get back to the origins of Clarion. What I'm saying is when Damon Knight had a critique group in his living room,
uh-huh.
there wasn't anywhere else to talk about their stories. There wasn't anyone paid to teach about their stories. There wasn't any, do you know what I
Sure.
mean? There wasn't like, well, should I do this? Like why are we talking about this in the living room? Well, I could just go to the real official place that one applies to and is admitted to and to learn this thing.
Right.
No, that did not exist. It does now more. It did
I
not
guess
then.
all I'm saying is the same thing happens in LitFic, right? It just happens like, why do we have the MFA
Sure.
programs? They emerged as a response to, we need a place where we can do this work, right? And be taken seriously. Why do we have the small
Right.
presses?
But that's
Because we need
different.
a place that we can do this work that isn't what the big publishers value and is commercial. It's the same thing, I think. And,
Okay.
and
It
the
may be the
same,
same instinct, but it was historically organized in a different way. What I find so interesting about Clarion is
yeah,
that, and that I mean, you know more about the literary worlds. I'm not saying there's no analog.
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
saying in the time that it emerged, first of all, there were these peer workshops, this style of peer workshop critiquing that was promulgated
Mm-hmm.
by like mostly people associated with kind of the new wave in science fiction. I think the
Mm-hmm.
previous like big three Campbellian era, there was a certain swagger of like, revise? I don't revise. I just type it out and send it off and they buy it, like 3 cents a word. That was the previous generation. I think when science fiction started having more stylistic and, line level ambition, not that there was no, I mean, there was some line
Mm-hmm.
level ambition. People, they appreciated polished prose, but when it had sort of more grand ambition, there began to be this culture of like workshopping and critiquing each other's stories. And sort of famously, I guess Kate Wilhelm and Damon Knight's living room in Milford, Pennsylvania was where these people got together and read each other's stories. And then eventually it became this official thing
Mm-hmm.
ish, Clarion. And I think it was originally anchored at, right, if it was at Michigan, like it was in an academic
East
setting,
Lansing, Michigan.
East
Yeah, I
Lansing.
think that's where.
Had some
Yeah.
the first one had some affiliation with an academic program, but essentially it is not. It feels very different. It is not an on ramp to a terminal degree. You're not going to have any letters after your name. It's 6 weeks, so it's a
Mm-hmm.
weird. 6 weeks is a weird amount of time. It's not the amount of time that you would just take a night course to do something on the side. Like 6 weeks of very
Right.
intense work where you can't be doing something else in parallel means you are essentially like maybe quitting your job or like taking off
Mm-hmm.
like a lot of time. Like it's a lot of time, especially for Americans. That's a lot of vacation,
Yeah.
right? So it's this break in your life, but it does not deposit you on a path in the way that an academic degree does. If you are like, I have this degree, I took out federal loans, I am now on this track, I will, I'm not saying that an MFA does anything, like an
No, no, no.
MFA does
I
not
know.
get you a
I know.
job.
No, I think it's just your. I'm not disagreeing with you, but it's not the same as an MFA. But in the lit world, there are all these writing residencies, which I think are very similar in that they typically run 2 to 6 weeks. Some are longer, some are a semester, some are 3 or 4 months, and there are hundreds of them, if not thousands. I'm not sure around the world, and you they don't lead to a degree. The idea has
Yep.
always
Okay.
been, here's a place to come and do work, right, in the company of other writers, and some of them have a workshop component, many of them don't. So
Well,
I
anyway,
don't. Clarion's not
I'll
so
get away
special.
from my feeling that science fiction has a distinctive vibe. Whatever. I mean, it's a writing residency. So Clarion is a writing residency for science fiction writers. I think because there's not that much stuff like that in science fiction,
Mm-hmm.
and there weren't back in the day that many places you could go to study science fiction. It has a centrality in a field which I am, there. It's not that there's whatever. It has a particular centrality in the science fiction field. The Clarions. There
Right.
was one, and then there were two, and then there were three, and now it's back to two. There's one in Seattle and one in San Diego at the moment. There's other things like them.
Right.
There's
There's Odyssey and Viable
Odyssey. There's
Paradise.
Viable Paradise. There's a
Right.
bunch of entry level writing workshops
And
now.
I think
But
it might be worth clarifying this.
mm-hmm,
I think there's some interesting distinctions between those three, right? So my understanding is that Odyssey is also a 6 week thing, if I'm remembering right, but it is taught by a single instructor, and
mm-hmm,
she teaches it in a very craft focused, very intensive way.
yeah,
Whereas Clarion, because people don't know, is 6 weeks where you have a different instructor or pair of instructors for each of the 6 weeks, and they bring in new people every
mm-hmm,
year, right? So it will be a long time before someone repeats at Clarion if they do, as a teacher.
as an
And
instructor. Yeah,
right, whereas Odyssey, it is the same woman teaching. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her name because I have a terrible memory, but I'll look it up. But the but the but it's the
let
same
Darius look it
same
up.
person teaching. So um, So, but and then Viable Paradise, I believe, is 10 days, where the idea is that it's viable, right? Because six,
Right.
no, that's
You
that's
don't
where
have
the
to
name
break your
comes
life to
from.
do it.
You
Yeah.
don't, yeah,
Yeah.
you don't have to take 6 weeks out, and so which I think is super interesting. Um,
So,
and then there's Paradise Lost is for the Paradise Lost is the name
all
of
right.
it.
But
There's
before we
one,
get to all the others, I don't
yeah,
think we
yeah,
actually
yeah,
said what Clarion is. So in the sense
sure.
that, 6 weeks writing residency, and the it's always a mix of instructors, some of whom are new and emerging, some have different talents. But
Mm-hmm.
but one thing is you get these very, because science fiction is a small world and Clarion's so central, you get these very heavy hitters. Like we're like the year that we're teaching, or Jemison
Mm-hmm.
is week 6. I had Octavia Butler and Connie Willis. Like there's usually like at least some people who are, they don't need this much, like,
Yeah, 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 yeah. No,
these are
sure.
not people who, this is that's also distinctive from, I'm not going to tell you there's not some equivalent in the literary world. Maybe there's plenty of literary 6 weeks residencies where, you know, I mean, gosh, or Salman Rushdie will show up to teach for a week. I'm not saying there's not. What I'm saying is that there's a distinctiveness about Clarion in the science fiction world, and there's something that sort of strikes me as this very joyful reaffirmation of the field as a community, that like there's no reason that that Neil Gaiman or George R.
Mm-hmm.
R. Martin needs to like drop everything for a week and come teach 17 people who just got it, who are mostly unpublished, right? There's no reason that should, there's no logical reason that should happen. It's really mostly paying it forward,
Yeah,
and like the maybe the like celebratory glory and prestige of like, because Clarion's such a thing, right? That it's like it's an honor to be asked. So anyway, so it's by application. Many
mm-hmm.
people apply, they send stories. Some people who are well published and even have won some awards have occasionally gone. I remember there being some pushback about that, because there's a sense that it's really for beginners, but for beginners who are ready to take the next step. So that it's a
Mm-hmm.
selective process. There's usually like 17 people. They range widely in age. I think we had like
Mm-hmm.
18 to 50s in our,
Right.
maybe,
Us
or
too.
40s.
Yep.
And but there's this sort of a weird sense that you're all starting at the same place, even if some people may be published already or whatever. There's some different, but
And
it's kind of this cohort,
it does throw
even though you're
things
wildly
off.
different ages.
I think it's tricky when you have, in my MFA program, I came in with a book publication, like a small press book, my first book, and that was a problem. I didn't realize it would be a
Yeah.
problem, but most of the people in my MFA had not published anything, much less a book, right? And so it sets up a tension, and that you're not on the same page exactly, and you're not at the same stage in your careers. And so I can sort of understand why Clarion kind of discourages
Yes.
more published people
Right,
from
right.
applying,
Yeah, I
right?
think it is meant, and it's also like you have this one, it's meant for beginners, and so it's a boot camp. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
6 weeks. They no longer, in my day, they told us that we were supposed to write a story, one story a week for 6 weeks. I
Me
think they've
too.
gone softer on that, because I think, of course, that is very hard on some people, and people they're probably accounting for people's different, accommodating people's different rates and needs and whatever. But even so, it's a very intense hothouse atmosphere in which you're critiquing, you know, uh, potentially you're critiquing 17 stories and writing a new story every week, right?
Yeah. And I think the hothouse thing is worth, at least
Yeah,
mentioning that I think it's a very intimate atmosphere,
yeah,
because here you are with 16 other people who love the same stuff you love,
yeah,
and you're talking about it, every waking hour of the day for 6 weeks.
yep.
Um, so
And
there,
bearing your soul. I mean, they're looking at
yeah,
your raw, unfinished stuff and telling you exactly what they think of it for like hours a
yeah.
day in this room. But I think probably there's still a stuffed animal that you can hug, and
Mhm.
we had a stuffed frog that whoever was being critiqued could hug. But you have like hours a day of everybody telling you what they think, and even if it's done, and there's been new thinking about how to do
Mm,
it. I there was an essay from that came in the packet from Andy Duncan, giving like a bunch of like, there's lots of interesting, lots of ways that I think they've departed a little from the original hardcore, the original
I
Milford
think that, well,
model.
they're trying to take more neurodiversity into account and marginalized
Yeah,
backgrounds and so
exactly,
on, right?
exactly.
So,
And I think in a very smart way, that's not specific, but that's saying what broke up, what about this original way of doing it was hard on
mhm.
some people, and maybe if we do it differently, it's better for everybody, not
Yeah.
just those people. Um, but the original style involved the person being critiqued not saying anything until everyone else had had, like, in turn, 2 or 3 minutes, and then, all around in a circle. Usually the instructor at Clarion goes last, and then, then the author could sort of clarify or whatever, and various other things. I think one of the reasons they got away from that is because, when all the people were very culturally similar in a way back at Milford, there was a bunch of shared expectations, and you probably kind of knew what the story was trying to do. And so everybody giving you their critique before the author went preserved a certain freshness that you weren't polluted by what the author was trying to do. But in context where, you're the only person who has some background, and you're being critiqued by a bunch of people who don't have that background, and they go around and all of them say, I didn't get the thing about this, because they're just missing some piece of context and they're not necessarily your audience. That's very frustrating, right? So I think now there's more ability for the person being critiqued to steer and be like, let me like, I know none of you people get this thing, but everybody in where I'm coming from gets this thing. So can I just explain the thing so that you're on the same page as the people who would actually be reading this? Whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I think
Anyway,
that I want to highlight something you said about kind of this everyone being from the same background. I would say it's more an assumption that everyone's from the same background, and even way back when, right? Because, and I'm thinking about this old Clarion phenomenon of the goat, right? And this,
yeah,
this, when we talk about an intimate hothouse atmosphere, one of the things
right.
that can happen is that it can get emotionally intense, and it's very easy for humans to start engaging in kind of like gang behavior. I don't even know what the right
Mm-hmm.
term would
Mm-hmm.
be for it, right? Where you kind of, and there used to be a real problem with people would sort of end up picking on one person who would end up being essentially emotionally excluded.
Like
And
this scapegoat. Yeah.
yeah, and I know two of people that happened to who really hate
Mm-hmm.
Clarion as a result, right? And so how
Yeah.
terrible to like go, give up your life for 6 weeks, go to this thing that you are expecting to be
Mm-hmm.
joyous and welcoming and
Yes.
fabulous, and
Right.
then feel excluded and shattered, at the
Right.
end of it, right? And
Right.
so
And that's something they've worked really hard on. And I
yeah,
remember that Nalo Hopkinson had written us a letter
yeah.
before I went to Clarion, putting the fear of God into us about this whole phenomenon. Like, do not, like, not on my watch,
Right.
which
That's
had a
right.
huge effect. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it was very
That's
formative.
very
And
mellow. I love
yeah,
that.
yeah, and yeah, I think that hothouse atmosphere is very. I mean, in other ways, I mean, that was one phenomenon. The scapegoating. It's interesting because I mean, I think it's like so raw, and people cling together, and there's that idea of a goat is interesting. I mean, it's interesting also that it's that formation, because you can easily imagine it would be splitting into two factions, or you know what I mean, like.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a way in which I think it's like consensus format, like somebody who's violating the consensus or something. Anyway, I don't know.
Although, in the two cases that I was thinking of, one of them was gay and the other one was black, right? And it was,
Mm,
I think, I think
yeah,
that absolutely factored in. I would also say that part of it is the competitiveness, right? Is I think fosters that sort of thing. There's a way in which in the old days, I remember one of our instructors said to us early on, you know, of the 17 of you, 3 or 4 of you will end up writers, and maybe 4 or 5 of you will end up editors or otherwise working in the field, and the rest of you won't, right? And that, I think, is, I don't know if that was meant to be like, here's a dose of realism, but I
mm-hmm,
think the
mm-hmm.
effect is often to increase competitiveness and can be kind of
Yeah,
crushing and lead to like, well, I'm not going to be the one left out.
which
I
is so
better be,
funny, right?
right?
Yes, I agree. That was probably meant. I mean, it's that statement probably statistically true on
Mm-hmm.
average, probably meant as a dose of right, but like such a temptation for this very natural human logical fallacy. And like, let me
Mm-hmm.
just be very clear here: competitiveness at Clarion completely based on a logical fallacy. The idea that if that there's 17 just these 17
Yeah.
people. There's a lot. You're competing with 100,000 people. You have 17 of them in a room with you. The idea that by being better than one of the 17 people as opposed to the 100,000 people that would help you somehow, like if they are do
Yeah.
worse, you're doing better, is wholly a logical fallacy. The way
Yeah.
to win Clarion, attention, future students, is all to form a band and pull each other up and support each other. Like that will so much more make you like there is no when yes, statistically some will be right or some will be not. But let me tell you, in a Clarion where everybody is pulling for each other, a lot more will end up staying in the
Yeah.
game than in a Clarion where you're trying to push each other down. That's just
Yeah.
there's
And the
these
same
aren't
thing is
there's not
absolutely
slots. There's not
right.
slots coming out of your Clarion. That's a terrible way to think.
Well, and I'll say, in fact, science fiction is, I think, generally better about this than mainstream lit, because in MFA programs, that phenomenon is even stronger. I
Yeah,
think that sort
yeah.
of competitiveness, and it always makes me crazy. I'm like, like where people start trying to divide up the pie, and like, we need to
There's
grow a
no,
bigger
yeah,
pie. No, we need to
yeah,
grow a bigger pie. There's so many more
sure.
people who could love our stuff if they knew about it.
Well,
Let's
I
all
mean,
promote each
that's
other,
one thing. One
right?
thing is
And
that even globally, it's non-zero sum. But then,
right,
but you can imagine some kind
right.
of scarcity mentality in which, if you literally know who there is some slot and 5 people are competing for it, and yes, then it takes a big. If you're going out for, I don't know, an audition for a show and you know from your agent that there's
Hmm.
4 other people on the list, I understand feeling competitive. And it does take a very long-term view to say, oh, but maybe I'll miss this one, but we'll grow the audience for the thing that we all love. That
Right.
would be great. But in the case of like a program where you happen to have 10 people in front of you, but you're actually competing with 100,000 people, it is nonsense to treat those 10 people as your rivals,
Right.
right? Like,
Agreed.
even if you
Yeah.
are completely zero sum, even if you're
Yeah.
like, no, there's only a certain number of books to be, still you would want this 10 people to be your team and try to get as many slots for that. That would make so much more logical sense. Anyway, so hothouse. The other thing is that not just the goading phenomenon or whatever, but the and competitiveness. We covered that, but also there's all this tempestuous, like your soul is bared. You're dealing with
Hmm.
these people. You're in this, so there's often a lot of like divorces and like new
Romances,
relationships that start at
etc.
Clarion, and
Marriages.
like
Yep.
it's a very stressful situation. And it's just there's a way in which like I neither want to you know I neither want to make scare people about it, because like it's
Hmm.
perfectly fine. I went to Clarion and just did the thing, right? I mean, you don't have to blow up your life. Nor do I want to romanticize blowing up your life, because that's tough. But there's a way in which it is also very understandable, because it's like there is a sense in which you're being reforged, which you don't want to buy into too much. Like there's a way in
Yeah.
which it's like,
No, but
don't
yeah,
get brainwashed
we
by it, but it does feel like this passage that you're going through where you're going to do this
yeah.
thing that you probably have never gotten that much intense time to do so far. You're going to do it very intensely for 6 weeks, and
Yeah. We've used the term hothouse and we've used boot camp, but I think the one you're
mm,
referring to now is crucible, right? Like when you say
yes, yes,
reforged, right?
right.
That's so.
It's
And
a
Clarion
crucible,
can
very
can
much
certainly be a crucible. I think
can
it
be a
is.
crucible.
It is not for everybody. I'm sure there are people who just
The
come take the
the other
classes and
yes,
then don't engage in that way.
the
But
other thing I would say, but that is also part of the glory of it. Part of what's nice about it is that by and large, people who come to Clarion, this is something they've really wanted, because 6 weeks off your
mm,
life and you can, applied, sense story, I don't know, whatever. Like you're going to do a lot of work. Like there's a great seriousness of purpose, which is great.
mhm.
It's not like, I mean, it
It's
sort of
not
felt in some
casual.
ways.
Yeah.
I mean, I did Clarion when I was like 30. I had been, it was many years since I'd been in that kind of academic environment. And there's a way in which we were back in a dorm. Like it sort of
Hmm.
felt like going back to college, but also it very much felt like different than that, because there was no sense that there was some class with a bunch of people who, I don't know, they just signed up for this because they were trying it out or they had to fulfill a requirement or something. Like it was this intense seriousness of purpose that
Hmm.
people were like, this is I've set aside particularly people coming from the working world where 6 weeks off is hard. Like,
Yeah.
they were like, I've got these 6 weeks to do this. Like that intensity of purpose created a very charged and awesome environment in a lot of ways. The other thing I would say, though, as cautionary, is that so I went to Clarion and I wrote 6 stories, one a week. One of them survived. It did well. The one that survived, the very first week, what I wrote the very first week with Octavia Butler, did well and survived. The others, none of them came to anything. That's not a universal experience,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it points to a larger thing, which is what happens at Clarion is like important, but it's optimized for learning. It's not optimized
Mm-hmm.
for like when you're talking
Producing,
about like, well, you do
yeah,
a
finished
writing
stories. Yeah.
residency where you could have 6 weeks to work on something. It's not really the vibe. It's not really the vibe of like, well, I've blocked these 6 weeks off to get some work done on this thing that I can. It's more like you're trying out a lot of stuff and trying new
Mm-hmm.
directions and getting a lot of things thrown at you. And I did not have those stories that I wrote there were stillborn as stories because they got too
Mm-hmm.
much attention too early. They were they were very
Mm-hmm.
rough. They were moving too fast. I couldn't get my head back to them after the 6 weeks going back to look at the stories. But, and some people that's not true of, but I would say that also like the end of Clarion is not the finish line, right? Like
Right.
you're having this massive input and learning all this stuff and trying out these things and having, growing whatever. It's not like what you end up with at the end of the 6 weeks is what you end up with, right?
Right.
Like you're probably like, I mean, it's fine to be an overwhelmed mess who felt like you got nothing done at the end of the 6 weeks. That still could be a highly successful Clarion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because all that stuff's going to sink in, and all those things you tried are going to have pushed you in new directions. And the game is it's the long. Try look 10 years after Clarion, see what
Right.
happened, right? That's the finish line, not or when you die, not like the day after, because exactly because it's not an environment that particularly privileges like completing things and polishing things, or you know what I mean. It's engagement, it's very high engagement, and you're trying to
Right.
learn and you're trying to do the best you can, but it's like being thrown again and again
Right.
into the soup. It's very yeah, it's a crucible is a good word.
Right. I mean, it's interesting. I keep thinking about like how does this compare to the I teach writing workshops at UIC, right? So how does it compare to that? And it is those are over 15 weeks, so
Mm-hmm.
not, and it's not the only thing you're doing, obviously,
Yep.
so not intense in the same way. But especially in the intro level workshops, similar purpose, right? We give them lots of exercises, we have them try lots of things. There's many things that are going to be new to them, and it's not about finishing a story that's ready to publish, right? I mean, and even in the upper level workshops, I usually try to encourage them to get something to that stage and send it out, because that's such a barrier for people, like that first time you send something out.
Yeah.
So I just want them to have that experience so that they can, but I don't also the experience of getting your first rejection
Right,
and
right.
going on
And
and
that
writing
begins a
something else,
virtuous
right?
cycle. Like
Yeah.
ideally that begins a virtuous cycle. You start sending things out and getting rejections and learning and sending things out, and that, yeah,
Yeah.
it avoids the fear of trying to get anything perfect before you send it out, and there's lots of good things about that. Yeah, but again, that's Clarion, no time
Clarion.
for that.
Right, right. You're not going to send. I mean, I suppose you could
You
send somebody to
might.
Clark's
That'd
World
be
and get a
great.
response in a day
Well, that's
because
true.
they
That's
respond
true.
so fast. But typically, you
You
wouldn't.
probably don't want to like right after the critique send it out. Yeah, you
Yeah,
probably want to take it after
let it
Clarion.
sit for a bit. Yeah, let it
Yeah,
sit
and
and
I mean,
simmer.
the other thing that's important to note is that you are not just learning to write at Clarion, but you are learning to critique and you are learning to
Mm-hmm.
understand critiques. And that is, in some ways, just as important and crucial a
Yeah.
skill. And again, if you're playing a long game and you're trying to, like one of the best things you can have is like a community of people where you have this mutual trust that they understand your work and you understand theirs and you can articulate things they can't and so on. And so, like, at Clarion, you are starting ideally to build your team and
Mm-hmm.
also to build the skills that will allow you to build your team. You know what I mean? That you could take
Yeah.
back home to your local critique workshop and whatever. That is like,
Or
I,
even if
you
you're
know,
working on your own, I think that
yeah,
I often feel that and I tell my students this, that the thing that will teach them the most in our writing workshop is the work they do critiquing, right? That
mm-hmm.
when they are looking at their classmates' stories and taking apart what is working and what's not working in those stories, that will then be something they bring back to their own writing,
Well,
and
and interestingly, there are three things, right? So
mm-hmm.
there's you writing and getting critiqued. There's you critiquing and learning to think about another story, and then there's the third position where you're listening to person A critique person B, and
Mm-hmm.
often that's where you get the
Yep.
most insight because you have
Yep.
the least emotional, like you're not as wrapped up
Right.
in it, you're not so close to the work. You can actually see this person's mind
Mm-hmm.
working on this other story that this other person wrote, and you could see both their thinking, and that actually is very like that's some of the best stuff is when you're in a room watching people critique people, and like as you grow to know them and learn from each other, that is some of the best stuff. So did we explain what Clarion
I think
is?
we mostly did. I feel like we could sort of transition from there into maybe I was thinking we should transition into the actual lesson planning and
Yeah.
specifically maybe talking about the fact that we're week one.
Week one,
And
yeah. So I wanted, yeah, our
yes.
mandate for week one is very different. And that's what I was going to say. Is we got onto this tangent by my saying, well, I always dreamed of going to Clarion, but I always imagined that what you do as a Clarion instructor was that you critique the stories. And interestingly, they now don't necessarily. It sounds like they somewhat discourage the production of a full-fledged story during week one to be critiqued in week one. That's it. It
Mm-hmm.
sounds like they're like that's too much competition, and they find it a little unfair if some people who are faster come up with things and therefore get an extra critique. Like they don't want people to
Mm-hmm.
like, which is what I did. I like did pulled an all nighter so I could have a story to critique week one. Because in my day they were just saying week one is we're going to critique things, so we're
Mm-hmm.
going to critique submission stories unless you write one right now, and then I wrote one right then.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I guess they got away from that. So it seems like our mandate in week one is specifically being community builders, which is funny. And and sort of like I do feel like I don't know, but I have this feeling that like by doing this podcast we've been making like an audition tape. Like
That wasn't the plan,
I
but
wonder
yeah.
what they will say in order to how
Yeah.
will they talk about science fiction as a community. Anyway, so that's
Well, this is a lot of what we've been talking about now. I imagine we will probably repeat early in week one, talking about, building arts culture and being a crew and supporting each other. And this is your team that's going to, all of that, right?
yeah.
Like,
I have an idea I want to pitch you on, which I don't know
yeah, go.
if this is impudent of us, but I actually think that we should have a playlist of like 3 or 4 episodes that we assign before week one. Like, because there's a lot of stuff. There's literally episodes where we've been like, so if I was a Clarion, I would say this, and
Yeah.
I mean, some of the I almost want to call them kids. Some of them might be our age, but some of the students are gonna like find out that we're the instructors and be ambitious to go listen to those episodes, and others of them won't unless we assign it, and then everyone will. So it just seems like it's weird. Like if we go and just say all the things we've been saying on the podcast,
Right.
it'll be repetitive for anyone who's listening to the podcast. I feel like we should have a manageable size, and if they haven't got it, it's fine. But like it's not I'm gonna whatever. Then they can go back afterwards. But whatever. I'm just saying in the interest of we repeat ourselves a lot anyway. In the interest of
Mm-hmm.
being focused, we can say go listen to Lesson Planning, The Dark Night of the Soul, uh,
Sure. Yeah.
the
No,
the Turkey City
I
Lexicon, Escape from Turkey City.
yeah. I'm up for that. I think, giving them resources in advance is fine. I almost feel like anything we really want them to have heard, we should
Mm-hmm.
assign once we get there, right? Like that's your Monday
Yeah,
night
maybe,
homework is go
maybe,
listen to this, right? So,
maybe. Yeah,
but
I mean, yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, I don't know. That will be interesting. That's an easy question we can ask the
yeah,
administrators. Like, what is it
right.
typical to assign homework before? Because I think they did say you can. And I
You
mean, is
can,
it
yeah,
is it typical, and are people likely to have done it, and what is their experience with assigning homework? So anyway, I don't know. I just that it
sure,
strikes me that like there's a bunch of stuff we've said a bunch of times, and if we just tell them that, then we could start fresh with and have more because the podcast is very talky. Like we deliver a
right.
lot of lecturing and on the podcast, which is great because it's a chat and that's good and that's what a podcast is for, and you can listen to it while you do your laundry. But at class, I would like it to be less what they call in German frontal instruction, Frontalunterricht, right? We'd
Interesting.
like more we'd like them more engaged in doing exercises and
Yeah.
doing things with each other and whatever, and not necessarily like just listen to us talk the whole time.
So I have two questions.
Yeah.
One of them, actually, let me just start with one of them. Is my Clarion, we there was a very standard format, right? You'd come at the morning for critiquing. It was like 9 to noon-ish, 9 to 1,
Mm-hmm.
depending.
Yeah.
And you'd have 3 people that were getting critiqued that day.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd spend about an hour on each one, and you'd go around the room, and the writer was not allowed to speak. People would give their critiques. The instructor would critique last.
Mm-hmm.
And typically, I think the writer didn't speak at all. and then when I started teaching workshopping, I did a modified version where, people did get to respond at the end, and then there was a back and forth for a bit, and I built in time for that.
I remember
But
at Clarion us always having to being able to respond at the end. Interesting.
yeah, it was, I don't know,
But
almost,
may depend on like the instructor and the
yeah,
culture.
it was kind of discouraged, I think, when
Huh.
I was there, but I was there earlier than you.
Yeah,
So
that's true.
they may have changed it. So then the other, I guess one piece of it I'm thinking about is, we do a lot of small group work
Hmm.
in my classes these
Yeah,
days. Not necessarily so much in writing workshop. Writing workshop is still typically a very similar format. But I'm wondering whether, in my lit classes, we do, and especially during the pandemic, we were teaching on Zoom. We did breakout rooms all the time.
sure.
And even pre pandemic, small group things. And it's so valuable in terms of, especially for those students who are hesitant to speak up, right? And
Mm-hmm.
what you see in the classroom is very typically at the start of the semester. A lot of what I'm doing is I'm trying to get the students to trust me, right,
Yeah,
and to feel empowered to speak. And what you'll see is when I'm asking the whole class things, only there will maybe be one or two students that are comfortable right
sure.
away with speaking. Most will be silent. But
Yeah,
if I put them in breakout rooms, and there's really a format I follow that's that, where I put 3 or 4 of them in each room, give them something to discuss, um, and tell them that I'm going to want someone from the breakout room to report back to the class as a whole, right?
yeah.
So, and then they get to come back, and then we go around, and so I get more voices that way. But also, when they're in the breakout rooms, it's tremendously lively. They are
Hmm.
very comfortable generally speaking to each other, right? So I'm wondering if we should. I'm wondering whether I should be doing more of that kind of thing in my writing workshops at UIC, but also whether we should try something like that at Clarion. So
Yeah.
what is your thought?
Well, I mean, I think it depends a lot on the topics, and so I think so. Here's my sense: is first of all, they're not going to have a story that they get critiqued that week. So week one is shaped differently. So it's not like we're
Right.
going to have their. So if we want to critique something, we got to get them to write something. It's got to be like a flash fiction exercise. So that's what, you know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
pretty
Sure.
much. Or a or they're critiquing or they're practicing learning critiquing, not writing. So it's not something any
Mm-hmm.
of them wrote. They're critiquing another thing, like something we wrote or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
some standard thing. I don't know. Um, I don't think that it should be. I think we should avoid it being too school like. Do you know what I mean? In a way, I don't think I don't think the mandate at Clarion is really to teach them like. I mean, I think it's fine to have craft things and being like this is an exercise and point of view or whatever. But I think that like I don't know, I don't remember any moment at Clarion where the teacher asked the class, so can someone answer this question that I'm asking, and then called on someone who raised their hand. Never happened, right? I do not remember anybody being like, so can anyone tell me what that was not a thing,
I don't
right?
remember. I feel like Lucius Shepard and Chip Delaney both did
Really?
for my
Well,
Clarion. Yeah, it was specific
okay.
teachers. It was
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
and
I
their
mean,
approaches.
it's very much the style. I think that yeah, I just feel like because I mean, and that has various problems, as you say. There is the problem of like, how do you get? There's that typical classic management problem. If you're trying to have that, and if you have a semester to do that to build trust and whatever, then by
Mm.
the end, maybe the shy people are speaking. But we have a week,
Yeah.
so the traditional Clarion thing where it's like everyone has this 2 minutes time. That doesn't matter whether you're shy or bold. No one else is
Right.
talking. Just you're talking. The timer is running. It's your time. I
Right.
actually think that's very powerful, and
Mm.
I feel like okay, we're not necessarily going to do the author shuts up, everyone goes, there's a story, particularly because it's week one. But I do think that, like, honestly, I mean, I almost prefer something where either people work in parallel or they get time one by one or whatever. Do you know what I mean? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, why ever have a free for all where the loud people talk more? But it doesn't.
Okay,
You don't
but
ever
well,
you don't ever need to. Yeah.
let me make the argument, right? So one problem I see with the go around the circle and everyone gets 2 3 minutes is what often happens is that you know the first 3 or 4 people say the things that most people want to say, and then the rest of the group feels frustrated and like,
Huh.
and will often just say, well, everything I wanted to say has been said, et cetera, so on, right? And
I
so
mean, I do not remember that ever happening at my Clarion, because the ditto is this very powerful mechanism. You
we
say
haven't talked
ditto
about the
Jackie on this,
ditto.
ditto ball on this. Yeah, and the ditto is this
Yeah.
very powerful mechanism where you cite who you agree with, who you the ditto, the anti-ditto. Sometimes we would have a semi-anti-ditto. Where you're like ditto this person on this, ditto this person on this. You do not need to repeat it. That's very much the culture that I remember from Clarion style critiquing. Is you do not need to say again a thing a person said. And if you have to pause, it's great if you go, well, here are the top 3 things that everybody said. Ditto this person, ditto this person, ditto this person. Now I pause because I was out of my first things. Now is the moment where I'm going to come up with the new thing that no one. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you don't have anything, you could pass, but it happens so rarely. If there's a comfort level
It
of being
happens a
like,
lot in my classrooms. So
I'm not sure that's a predictor. Did it happen at your Clarion? Because it seems like it's a very different set of people, right? It's a very different, like,
I
even if they're
can't.
the same, even if they're
I
literally
honestly,
the same
I
people,
honestly
they're in
can't
a very different
remember.
place. They're in a very different
Yeah,
place.
I can't
Like,
remember, but I think it would be something to ask the Clarion people about.
sure,
Is
sure.
that do you see this phenomenon happening? If it's not a problem, it's not a problem. That's great. I mean, I would say in grad school, it wasn't really a problem because we were all so immersed in it. We had plenty to say, right?
Which I think
But
is maybe more predictive, right? Like, these are people that everybody, had to get in, they have to be at a certain level to get
yeah,
in. It's 6 weeks, and they're going to be with these 6 weeks. It's 70 people, 6 weeks. That's very different than, like, it's one of the classes that and I don't really do the reading, and you know what I mean? Like, I was a party last night, and this is only part of my
no,
attention.
I understand, but it is very high pressure, I think, for to be like person 16 in the circle coming up with something new to say. I think can be stressful, right? So
Yeah.
anyway,
Well, anyway,
so
but again, that presumes that there's a thing everybody's critiquing, which is actually not week 1. So I think what we should think about is I think let's come at what I would like to say. I mean, all these are good techniques. I like the idea of small groups could be appropriate depending on what it is.
yeah.
Going
I'm
around could
not
be
saying for the
appropriate.
whole thing. I'm just sort of thinking like it's
I
it's a tool we could use, and I think it's
Sure.
very generative,
Yeah.
typically.
But I
So
think, and there's other things. I mean, I particularly
generative
like,
and empowering. So
there's sometimes a useful, like, one, just if we're talking about tools in the toolbox, one useful thing that I think is very powerful for uh, that comes out of, like, the software world is where you're trying to avoid that same pattern of, like, the talky people having more weight. Like, when you're doing something like a retrospective in
mm-hmm.
software, and you don't want, like, just to hear from the same people you always hear from, then one thing you do is you have everybody, like, let's say what you're doing is you're trying to say, what did we like and didn't like about what happened last week, and what should we change, right? You don't want the
Mm-hmm.
same loud people who always dominate everything to talk, because then you're going to have the same thing as you did the previous week, right? So what you do is you have everybody write down what they want to say and stick it on a
Mm-hmm.
board, and then you have everybody go around and vote by putting a dot on, like, 3 of them that they want to talk about, and then you pull the ones with the most dots and talk about those, right? So, like, essentially instead of serially going around and hitting everybody, which is very powerful, but of course everybody only gets a little bit of time, you
Mm-hmm.
can get the whole team to work in parallel, everybody silently at once, to decide what we talk about. And
Mm-hmm.
then, no, I'm not saying that's necessarily appropriate for Clarion, but I'm just saying that,
Yeah.
and I've used that in, like, game mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of things where it's like it's very powerful to have people do a thing in parallel and then
Yeah.
crystallize around the thing. Um, but okay, all that was, like, content free. What I really want to talk about is, what do we want to teach them the first week? Because I think the way that we teach them, the way that we do it, will fall out of, like, what is the thing we want to convey, specifically because it's the first week, right? We're not doing the critiquing. We
All
might
right.
do some critiquing if we assign some exercises,
Yep.
but we trust that Nora and all them and Cat Rambo and all the people coming after us will be, like, line level editing all these people's stories that they're producing.
Mm-hmm.
In our week, they need to gel as a community, which is not going to be competitive, but going to support each other for the next 20, 30 years. B, learn to understand what critiquing is, so that when they come into week 2, they are really helpful to one another and really learning from the experience. And C, getting revved up to write, and to stretch, and thinking about how to approach Clarion so that they will get the most out of it. So, like, trying things they haven't tried, learning and growing, being unafraid to take risks. That, I would say, is the major mandate of week 1. So it's less about like teaching them point of view. And I mean, it's fine if we want to do some exercise teaching point of view or whatever, that's fine. But I don't think this is really mostly about delivering a fixed curriculum of like writerly tricks and tips, because it's like, it's a week of their 6 weeks, and
Mm-hmm.
we want to set them up to succeed at Clarion. I would like them to. And another thing is that one thing that Clarion does, because it's mostly pro writers, and I'm sure this won't just be our week, but it is also our week, is that it's not is that a lot of it is practical knowledge about how to approach being a writer in the world and the industry and all that stuff. And again, they'll have another 5 weeks of that, but like whatever we distinctively have to say about that. One thing I would like to have a lesson on is that because we've talked about it on the podcast, and I feel like when I have 17 new writers in my clutches, some of whom may go on to achieve prominence at various times in their lives, I really want to tell them what to do when they get dogpiled on the internet.
Okay.
Right?
So yes,
Like I feel like that's
here's
I
my
have this
here's my
moment to
proposal.
prepare them for that.
My
Yes.
proposal is we should break for intermission.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to take a minute and think about what are the things that I would like to teach in week 1. Because it may not be the same things as your focuses. Like we may have
Mm-hmm.
to have our separate lists and then winnow it down, right? Because
Sure.
we can't do everything. So
Sure.
let's do that and come back and make a plan.
Sounds good.
Okay, taking a break.
Intermission. Beginneth.
Hello, humans. My name is Darius, and I myself am a human, specifically a human producer and editor for the podcast. We bring you this short intermission to remind you that the MRAH and Rosenbaum Are Human show is a project of the Speculative Literature Foundation, or SLF for short, a nonprofit 501c3 dedicated to promoting literary quality in speculative fiction through our grants, programming, content, and our newest additions, courses and workshops. Please visit our website at www.speclit.org to learn more about the organization and what we have to offer. If you are a fan of the show and the things we're up to at the SLF, you could support us by becoming a member at $2 a month or more at www.speclit.org/membership. Your monthly donations go a long way in keeping the lights on and projects chugging along here at the SLF, including this podcast. Alternatively, you can support the show by following or subscribing to the podcast, giving us a 5-star rating, and telling your friends and family about us. Now, back to the humans you are actually here to listen to.
Hey, we're back from our intermission. This is Monraj and Rosenbaum Are Humans with Benjamin Rosenbaum and Marianne Monraj. And today we are talking about lesson planning because we've recently been invited to teach at Clarion. So in the first half, we talked about what Clarion was. What we're going to be talking about now, I think, is what we specifically are thinking about what we'd like to do with week 1, which is when we'll be teaching. When we've just got all these new writers who are hopefully very excited to be there. And rather than, sitting down and critiquing a story from each of them during the week, we'll probably be trying to do some different things. So
let me tell you what they wrote us in their email.
Yeah, please.
We are inviting you to teach for us during week 1 of the workshop, which will run from June 25th to July 1st, 2023. The week is all about introducing the group to the workshop expectations and each other and building trust among the class so they can go into critique with each other's best interests for their stories in mind. We do not typically critique full-length stories this week, although some instructors will give them an assignment to write flash. I'm happy to discuss approaches you could take to this week. That is what we got as our mandate.
So one thing I would say, one thing we could do, I was going to talk about something else, but let me just mention this before I forget, is that one thing I do sometimes in the early weeks of a creative writing course is I will have them, do an exercise based on character, based on setting, etc. But I will recommend that they build on those so that by the end of it, they might have a story or the beginning of a story, right?
Yeah. I think that's one category of things is exercises that we could do would be story seeds, because they have to start writing that week. And I also particularly, following up on what you just said, one trick I would like to teach them very much is about having an abundance mentality toward ideas. So having like a list of 30, like when you're trying to come up with one good idea, it is much harder than coming up with 30 ideas, some of which will statistically be good. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But making sure that you just keep going and write down the bad ones is a very useful technique, right? So that kind of ideation would be good.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I'm thinking about like when I did a game workshop with Kel, and she had us come up. She set a timer and had us come up with 10 game ideas in, I don't know, 10 minutes or something. And initially I was like, that's impossible. And then we just did it. And it was, turns out, not impossible. Even though I'd never done it before. Everyone was able to do it. Right. So it's fascinating. Right. So I think that kind of thing would be super useful. But let me take a step back. I was thinking about what are the things that are important to me to teach newer writers. The week I taught at Clarion previously was at Clarion San Diego in, I think I was maybe week 4 or so, week 2, week 3, I can't remember. I mostly remember that I was the week before Neil Gaiman. And so towards the end of the week, people were getting very excited about Neil Gaiman. And so I was like, I still have you. You got to pay attention to me for 2 more days.
I suspect you taught week 3.
Maybe that could be. I don't know. But in any case, I ended up focusing. They left it very open that I could teach whatever I wanted, and I taught writing your identity was my focus for that week, which is not a typical craft focus. And the reason I taught it was because it has to do with what happens when I'm reading for an anthology or a magazine, which is that the bulk of the stories I get are not bad stories. They are competent, but they don't stand out, right? And so then the question becomes, well, what makes a story stand out? And there are a lot of different things that can make a story stand out, right? New ideas, fabulous prose, et cetera, and so on, right? But I kind of trust that they're going to get those aspects of craft elsewhere because they're covered in writing books. Other people will be teaching them. And one thing that I don't see talked about much is the stories that stand out because they're so clearly drawing on a wealth of identity in some way, right? Now, this doesn't have to be your identity. I usually start them with that because that's something they know intimately and can draw on, but it can also be researched, right? So, but there's a real difference between a depiction of a character that is fairly thin walking through a story and a character that has depth and a setting that has depth. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from when I push for that. So I'd like to do a lesson on that because I think it helps them like take their stories up a level.
Well, I like your specific, actually the thing I like about specifically your identity, not just identity, is that, well, if you're talking about the researched thing where it's like I'm going to put this in a setting and a distinct, where I'm thinking about the characters' identities and so on, that's the writing your identity is the complement to writing the other, right? There's this well-established now praxis around writing the other and like how you do research on that and whatever.
Right.
And I think that there's a it's not wholly symmetrical, right? Like in a way, it's like there's a like that is the other piece of it, and I feel like that is.
Well, I'll tell you, they were resistant. They were like when I came in one day and said Monday, I was like, this week we're going to work on writing your identity, and the pushback I got was kind of twofold. One was like, I want to write about dragons and wizards. I don't want to write about me, right? And then my life is boring. I'm boring. Or interestingly, from some of the students from various marginalized backgrounds, they did not necessarily engage with that material and didn't feel motivated to write about it and were somewhat resentful that I was asking them to do so, right?
Totally.
So that was super. I think by the end of the week, I had most of them on board, but it took a while.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I mean it's certainly important to set expectations if we're not going to devote the whole week to it, you know.
Yeah.
But I think that is we like to write, especially in science fiction, from this Archimedean point where we're not anybody and we're just, you know, the all-seeing eye, and that is of course very powerful, and like you should do that, but also it's a lie,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like you are necessarily like a conditioned, you know, and to some
Mm-hmm.
extent the thing about marginalized people not wanting to be crammed into that box is I feel like this is very natural developmental process that also both you and I went through, right? Like, I mean, you're like, and like most people I know,
Mm-hmm.
like that there's like a dominant hegemonic, like typical characters. You start by writing them because that feels real, like that feels
Mm-hmm.
like what literature is made of. I mean, this is probably less so in this generation to some extent along some axes than it was for us. But then, and then the ways if you are trying to talk about, like, I mean, your first, I think you've talked about this too, that like when you first started writing erotic on the internet, like you didn't, right? I mean, it's there's a
I wrote only about white people. Yeah, for
yeah,
like a
you're writing about
year.
white people and for
Yeah,
yeah, right.
yeah.
Like it takes a while. And I Dream Apart, the Jewish historical fantasy thing that I did. Like now I'm writing now I'm mostly working on this Jewish historical fantasy game, and I'm super like hip deep in researching Talmud and whatever. But like there's a lot of time where I did there was no way in, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I write about this in the essay
Yeah.
about the it's like my first conception of like how could you have a fantasy game built around Jewish characters was like farce. It's like Mel Brooksian, like Ruben Beglowitz, the accountant schlepping his sword into the dungeon, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's mismatched because there's not a good model for it. You only have and so it feels, you know what I mean? It feels like you're getting shoddy hand-me-downs. Like, can't I just write the barbarian that I know how to write about, that I've read, like did Conan? Like, I know how to write that. Making him Jewish, what? Now he has a kippah? That's ridiculous. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like there's it. You actually have to do a lot of work of invention to be
Mm-hmm.
able to align the thing that you love, right? The
Mm-hmm.
thing you've read that's given you pleasure, which is not match, and then the thing that you're being asked to produce, which is original, because the thing you've being
Mm-hmm.
in some way, the thing that you've come to love is generic
Yeah.
in some way, and then the thing that is distinctive about you that does not match, you have the urge to just push aside because you'd like to just do the thing that's fun. Why do I have to take the parts of me that are embarrassing and not, you know, not
Right.
part of the grand heroic narrative and like stick them back in? That's hard.
Yeah.
I think that's in, if nothing else, I think that the usefulness of talking about that even in a week in which we're
Mm-hmm.
going to try to cover a lot of stuff is simply to face that discomfort and say, look, there's really interesting gold here, though.
Yeah.
The very fact that this is uncomfortable, that integrating these things is like, and also there's a certain resentment of like, why am I appointed? Why do I have to, just because I randomly happen to have, you know, been
Right.
born with this particular identity, why do I have to carry the burden of articulating this identity? Which
Well,
is like, well, you don't. You don't.
in fact, I would say, one thing that helps get people around that is you and I both do engage with ethnicity and race, right, in our writing,
Yeah,
but you don't have to, right? Like
sure.
you can, we are all composed of many identities, right? And so one of the things I typically talk about when I'm doing these lessons is that, you know, we can talk about class, we can talk about religion, we can talk about, it can be urban versus rural, it can be sibling position, right? Like being the
Mm-hmm.
oldest child, right? I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
there's so many
Yeah.
aspects of identity. So that's one of the things I usually try and do at the start of the sequence is kind of like break that down and make it visible to people,
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
that then means you don't have to start with the most fraught
Exactly.
material,
Exactly.
right?
And also it doesn't have to be marginalized. It doesn't have,
Right.
right? It doesn't have to be like, we're not saying like find out where you are on the, you know what I mean? Like
Right.
the Benetton ad or whatever. Like
Yeah.
that's not the point. The point is like, like we just want to know you specifically. Like
Yeah.
inevitably literature becomes this generic sort of field of assumptions. I really like to know what it's like to really be a wasp.
Yeah.
Like, right? Like I don't know.
Have you seen the movie Metropolitan? That's a
No,
great.
is that what
Oh,
it's like about to be a wasp?
it's yes, it's a great one for that. Yeah.
There's something about, you know, it doesn't. The thing about whiteness is that it it is an agreement to obscure itself. It's like nothing to see
Yeah,
here, right?
that's
There's
right.
a certain amount of like, well, this is just a dominant unmarked state. Like, what do you mean white? No, just people. Let's just all be people, which is
Right.
like very specifically white, but it's sort of what's really interesting. I mean, and you talked about this during Race Fail. It's like, well, what kind of white? What was your
Yeah.
great grandmother doing? What kind of
Yeah, yeah.
food?
There's a
How do you
huge difference, right? A huge
like?
difference between like my grandparents came over on the Mayflower and I do cotillion and I'm in the
Yeah,
book
and cotillion's
versus
weird, and
right.
it's
Oh,
like
it's
there's
so
something
weird.
interesting about it, like discovering the
Yeah.
weird of even
You
the
know?
most marginal, like dominant thing. It's like it's really interesting to go and look at like what's distinctive and weird and interesting
Hmm.
about like even if it's like the thing we're all expected, or like straightness, like you know what I mean,
Yeah.
like monogamy, like that's like monogamy's weird, it's a strange practice, it requires all of this work, it's odd, like that's you know what I mean, and I mean, and not to investigate just in the like, yeah, I don't want a whole bunch more like middle-aged professors trying to having affairs with their interns like that. That's not the interesting part,
Well, but you
right?
know what? Wait,
I don't know.
let me pause and say
Yeah.
there was a bit
Anyway.
in I went to a conference, probably was AWP, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there was a panel on South Asian writing. I attended. I was a little baby writer. I wasn't on the panel. And the panelists, they were all South Asian women. And they said, look, the publishing world wants you to write your South Asian arranged marriage novel. You also
Mm.
probably want to write your South Asian arranged marriage novel. So write it, get it out of your system, and then you can write everything else. Right?
Interesting.
Doesn't have to be the only thing
I
you
thought you were
write.
going to say something else. I thought you were going to say the publishing industry wants you to write your arrangement. You probably want to write your. Those are two different things. Those are two different.
No, you actually,
Yeah.
like there's
Sure.
stuff that you probably want to say. So like, Chitra Divakarani, Bharati Mukherjee, they get critiqued for like writing the South Asian arranged marriage novel, but like it was a major part of their life. If you
Sure.
are a white male professor and middle-aged, facing like career, you never got as successful as thought you were going to be, your wife is not easy to be with, and
Mm.
this grad student is adoring, like that's like maybe the major challenge of your life. Go ahead and write about it. Now, if I'm the publisher, am I going to want to publish another one of those? Probably not, but at least write it, get it out of
Well,
your
but I
system,
think whatever it
and
is,
like,
but of course
you know,
the other thing is that it there this goes back to the thing about ideas, right? Another thing
yeah,
I'd like to teach them week one
yeah,
is to be profligate about ideas, right?
yeah,
You will quickly go from the point of view where you feel like it's hard to come up with ideas to the point where you have way more ideas than you could ever possibly finish.
mm-hmm,
And it's kind of like that, and because it's all in the execution, and you shouldn't be
mm-hmm,
worried about someone stealing your ideas because it is all in the execution. We could assign everybody to write the same
mm-hmm,
story, and they would be 17 different stories.
yeah,
And in a way, it's like, well, if you're gonna write your novel about, I don't know, the middle-aged whatever, the affair with your intern, like then then what about it is
yeah,
not the thing that we've read a million times, right? Like in
yeah,
a way,
yeah,
that's like actually there's a moment like that in Codwell Turnbull's The Lesson in the beginning where he doesn't have the affair, and it's like it does have this
mm,
feel of like that we're kind of heading
yeah,
towards this like middle-aged whatever, but it's just interesting and fresh, and it's not done, it
mm-hmm,
doesn't follow the predictable path. The thing I wanted to say about the your identity, why it's interesting about your identity, is because first, because just diving into specificity is a really cool, interesting place to start. And that
mm-hmm,
does not mean you have to give up the rest of the world. You're allowed to write about lizard people
sure,
or, well, lizard people. Well, that's an interesting choice. That is my identity. Anyway, so, but you're allowed to write about, cosmic goo bunnies,
mm-hmm,
but those two poles of like what you know intimately and what is
mm-hmm,
afar, and then the other thing is like, particularly about around it's not even marginalized is maybe too big a word for it, but like that moment, I think it is very interesting to look at that moment where you have this thing you love, this tradition you've been exposed to, and you have some part of yourself, which doesn't have to be on the official list of like census
mm-hmm,
categories or something. It doesn't have to be
yeah,
sexual orientation or,
mm-hmm,
race or whatever. It can be anything, but like the thing that you can't bring to, the thing that is like off to the side, the thing you don't know how to fit in, the thing that's like, well, that's
mm-hmm,
just me, but that's not important. It's unimportant and
mm-hmm,
shameful and not a part of, like, we have to play ball. We have to write Conan,
right,
we and that I think is really interesting tension because it's precisely the thing that is not yet on the page, right? Like it's
Mm-hmm.
apparently you didn't find it there in the play, like so
Yeah.
so that's really interesting. And if you can do the work of finding out how to connect that with the thing that you love, then it
Mm-hmm.
it brings a whole layer. Like we don't get that. That's this thing in you that you're hiding because it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
play ball, and we don't have it yet because
Yeah.
nobody brought it out. So
And the way
like
you bring it out is going to be different. Like it's interesting. When I first started writing, I didn't know of any other Sri Lankan writers writing science fiction, right? Now I can name several, and
yeah.
they all approach it differently than I do, right? And
Mm-hmm.
our takes on it are different. And if sometimes I'll
Totally.
pass things by them for critique, and they'll be like, but you didn't do this, and I'm like, interesting. I can see where you're coming from. That's
Yeah.
not part of my experience,
Yeah.
like it's,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and so I think I don't know, like there's a fear that you'll get pigeonholed into writing one kind of thing. But I just finished reading Aliette de Bedard's Fireheart Tiger, which is one of the Nebula nominees. I'm
Mm-hmm.
trying to, or Hugo nominees. I'm trying to read everything so I can vote before, like, I think I have 5 days left to get through one more novella and 3 novels. So I'm reading.
Cool.
But it's a Vietnamese political fantasy, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and I've not read any other Vietnamese political fantasy. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if they're out there or not, but if there's new writers coming up at Clarion who want to write from that material, they will be different than what she does, I guess, is what I'm saying. I think
Is Jeanette
sometimes I feel like
Gangley?
there's
No, she's
a
not.
sometimes I feel like there's sorry, what did
Never
you
mind. Go on. You made me start brainstorming who else, but yes, go on. Keep
Yeah.
talking.
Well,
Unimportant.
it's just one of those things. Right? I think where people are, I don't know, they sometimes you'll hear a conversation where people are stressing because they feel like only underrepresented people are getting published or whatever else. And so I want to emphasize to them, I've had friends who are writers say like, well, I can't write, a Jewish guy in my story because that's boring. And I'm like, it's not boring. It's not boring to me, right? Maybe it's
Right.
boring to you, but it's not boring to
Right.
me, right?
Right.
And so,
Well, and I think that's that same impulse. That's that same like
yeah,
that doesn't fit. That
yeah.
that's the same impulse on the other side, where if it's like where whether
Well,
it's like marginalized
well,
or yeah, similar though, right?
it's interesting. No, but I think in this case, he wanted to write a brown woman protagonist, right?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Right.
And so it wasn't that he was necessarily reaching for something that fit. It was that he
Right.
was somehow his experience.
Was not exotic, but that in a way is the same. Yes, that's the flip
Yeah,
side. That's the flip side.
yeah.
But again, the brown woman that he's writing is not. I don't know. You know what I mean? Like he's like. I mean, I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is yes, there's the standard and unmarked, and
Yeah.
there's the exotic, and both of those. I want to make a 4x4 or like a 2x2 table, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the unmarked standard, like Conan the Barbarian, and the exotic, like like I don't know, this is this brown woman with a sword. Both of those have this flatness, right? Which has to
Mm-hmm.
do with the fact that they are both projections in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I mean, I may, maybe I'm not giving this guy enough credit. Maybe he was particularly writing about a brown woman because he wanted to talk about hair care and Tampax or whatever. Do you know what I mean? Like maybe it
No,
was
no,
the
no.
unglamorous aspects, but
Right.
I suspect that a lot of the impulse is like it'll be interesting and dynamic if it's some other kind. You know what I mean? But that's not the like necessarily the detailed specificity of the. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
anyway,
Yeah.
so and the I'm boring, like I'm normal, I'm boring, that's also not worthy of writing about, is in a sense the same impulse as like I'm too different and strange and I wouldn't know how to articulate this. Those
Mm.
are those are both and it's funny, particularly funny that he's a Jewish guy because in a way there's a way in which Jews are in this odd middle position where it's like in the world that I grew up with, Judaism was both in a sense other, but also the nerdiest, most dweeby kind of other, right? Like it was
Mm-hmm.
like in a way, it felt like we had this conversation about whether I was a person of color in Arlington, Virginia, in 1970, which was not that long post segregation. The major axis was white and black, and in a way, being Jewish was the opposite of being black. You definitely
Right.
couldn't dance. You know what I mean? You were like the
Mm-hmm.
least street. So that, you know what I mean? Like in the
You were
cultural
you were almost
imagination,
the most white,
you were
right?
like too, yeah, you were like,
Yeah.
you were like too white. Like whatever's boring about being white, you were more of that than white people. So
That's
anyway,
hilarious.
but that thing of like being whatever it is, like whether it's
Yeah.
like Minnesota Norwegian and
Mhm.
you feel boringly white, like the effort of going and unearthing the weird, like that weird fish thing that Minnesota Norwegians eat. You know what I mean? The weird cultural
Right. Well,
specificity being that
no,
kind of
I
white
just read what is
is
it
the same
called?
effort as,
Not not Blood and Bone. I just read a memoir, and I'm going to blank on the title, but it was from a woman who was a Minnesota woman who had like gone and like tried to be a chef at high-end French restaurants, and then or not French, but like high-end restaurants, some French, some not, in New York, and ended up coming back to like live in like this shack. They had to like get running water in. It was a very exciting day, and like cooking, drawing on her mom's heavily fat-based cooking, right? To and thinking about survival and slaughtering pigs and like everything that goes into that life, and why did her mom slather the fat on when her friends were coming over, and why was it so delicious, right? And it was fascinating, I guess, is my point. My point is, to me, it was alien, fascinating to her. She was working through her stuff, and bringing out things that were not visible to the general public, perhaps.
And the other thing is, and the other thing is that there's that going back to like grandma's, like, fat slathering, like the original Minnesota cuisine, but also maybe that's not your experience. Maybe you eat at Denny's every day, but that's still interesting. Like the fact, if instead of thinking the fact that my life is composed of like Denny's and Starbucks and whatever, is instead of thinking like, well, that's just boring and normal and blank, instead of being like, oh my God, I had this original culture and it has been decimated by capitalism. Like I have been, like my culture's been strip mined for corporate. Like that's a really interesting place to start from. I feel like that. I feel like George Saunders has a certain amount of like that is like the cultural specificity of like monoculture, like the thinnest kind of. That's like as like dystopian satire. Like that's great. Like sure. Like so if you like literally eat at Applebee's all the time and that's the only like food that you have, like that, tell it, what's that like? Like, whatever it is, like, anyway.
I would say like nobody is boring, right? Every person is fascinating. And maybe that's kind of the starting point.
And look at it. And particularly in the context of fantasy and science fiction, this doesn't mean you have to set, first contact novel at Applebee's or whatever. But it's also okay to transmute it. I mean, I'm interested in hearing your story that's completely set on like an alien world among aliens, but it somehow partakes of Minnesota fat slathering. That's cool. Like we're not, nobody's saying you have to that you have to do like the autobiographical story about
So anyway, okay, I think we covered this, and I think I think this is
thumbs up on that one.
My proposal is that we should do this either Monday or Tuesday, and just kind of like throw them in. It will serve as introductions too, right? In that, like, we'll immediately start getting to know each other better. So
I feel like there could be an interesting icebreaker around this too, where it's sort of like go around and say.
I'll show you some. I have some exercises, so I'll show you some exercises, and we can think about that. So there's one idea. You wanted to talk about how to critique well, which I'm totally on board for, and it's important to do early, I think.
Yeah, but important to do early, and also in some context that there is something. I mean, that is the difficulty of doing that, is that we're going to be talking about it theoretically, and they won't.
No, but we can do it. But we can do it with
exercises,
and so on. I think we can totally. I don't think it should be all theoretical. I think we should practice.
Yeah,
so
I know. I think we should figure out how to ground that.
But we can do flash stuff for them, exercises and flash stuff. But we can also do like a published story, right? I don't think maybe one of ours, because my experience is that students
people are going to be gun shy.
They're hesitant, to critique the teacher, right? So the only time I've had that work is when I do it at the end of the semester, when they know me well and they know it's okay, right? So
right. Okay.
So
I think maybe critiquing towards the end of the week, though, when they're closer to having something. So sure.
Yeah. So
set them up for critiquing.
And then another thing I want to talk about, I was thinking about like, well, what are the things I wish I had understood when I was at Clarion? They're going to get a lot of rules thrown at them, right? And a lot of
and you know how I feel about those. That's why we're assigning Escape from Turkey City.
Yeah, so we definitely talk about that. But I feel like one thing that many writers I know struggle with is how the industry changes and keeping up with those changes, right? And so and I think a lot of times people get offered certain paradigms of like, this is what you do to succeed. You write short stories, you publish them in the pro magazines, then that attracts an agent's interest. You write novels, and then you can start building a career, right? And there's such a diversity of things that people are doing now. So I want to talk about the fact that Lois McMaster-Bujold, a multiple Hugo winner, Nebula winner, one of my favorite writers in the world, even though she has books still coming out from, I think it's Baen as her publisher, she now indie releases her pieces as sort of novelettes in sequence. So they end up, she puts out 6 of them and they build to a novel, but she's releasing them herself. And then Baen eventually brings it out as a book. And I think that's fascinating. And I talked to her about it, and she was like, well, what this is giving me is a more reliable income stream, right? And so I'd like to be sure that we help them open up that conversation, right?
I think there's a third part to that too. So that there's, in addition to the notion that, so there's like the standard things people are going to tell you about, like well-trodden things. There's the idea that the industry is going to change and and new things are going to become necessary. But the thing is that you have to know yourself and fit what you are interested in doing and are capable of doing to what makes sense, right? So there's people for whom like a book a year in a series that that they can build an audience around. The publishing industry is going to change a lot. I don't think that's ever going to be such a, you know what I mean? Like there's always going to be a place for that, right?
Or the romance author who writes a book a month,
a book a month, right? Or but on the other hand, there are people who are like, I mean, there's a whole bunch of paradigms, right? If you are somebody who, like a lot of people who are doing things, there's people who are like, maybe you need a Patreon and you just need to, spit out whatever you spit out in whatever medium you do. And I don't know, like, so there's a million ways.
So I think I want to present the fact that there's lots of different ways to do it. I want to caution them against getting locked into models that maybe don't exist viably anymore. Because I think, there are things that are much less, advances have gone down, right? So like, when you think about like, is this something that I can support a family on? You need to know some of the financial realities of that, right?
Right.
And, and the fact that you just have to pay attention to where the money is, if that's, because it's going to shift over time. And then, but I think what you were saying about knowing what you can do is super important. And I'm thinking this is where I like giving my students Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. And that first poem, the first essay that's like talking about like, don't listen to anyone. We should like have this for the critiquing day, like don't listen to anyone critiquing you. Don't show your work to anyone. Just go deep into yourself. Because for some people,
we had a whole episode about this that we will assign.
So for some people, that's going to be the thing, right? Like they're going to find that.
Well, and in some moments.
Yeah, they're gonna find that like maybe all the voices are getting in their heads and getting in the way of the story, right?
Yes,
and so I feel like that's a useful thing to frame in the first week, right? To like kind of think about like what are you're going to get some things out of this that are going to be immediately useful to you. You're going to get some things that are immediately not useful to you. Some things will be useful to you 10 years from now, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's how to critique and how to take critique are really important, and we can tell some stories about those. Again, I sort of feel like we should assign some. We can ask like, so who listened to the part?
It's okay.
Because to some extent, I feel like it would be easy to go on and tell the same stories again. I mean, I would love to sit in front of Clarion and tell the same stories again, but I think there might be more efficient, ways of doing it than I want to tell my embracing the new story and whatever. You've already heard it, podcast listeners. Okay, so yes, so critiquing story
and also, so
seeds,
not just for critiquing, but also, as you were saying, for
building a business model.
for building a business model, for like engaging on social media, for all of that, right? Like you have to figure out what works for you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What kinds of marketing, engaging on social media, going to cons, whatever. It's like if you do, and to some extent, what you're trying to create is a sustainable praxis for yourself that makes your life good. Like that's
good,
and
okay,
it
write
might.
that down. That's a good topic. No, like this is when I talk about the life of the writer. Like, how do you do this in a way that is sustainable? I think is a really good question, right? Like,
Yeah. And I think that's a broader conversation. And I think that that is the goal, a sustainable practice for yourself that makes your life good, right? And that is, and I feel like a lot of the framings of Clarion that I dislike, like the kind of the people, Harlan Ellison used to come and be like, you'll make it, you won't, you'll make it, you won't, right? And Delaney did like a modified version of that. And we've talked about that. And that kind of thing is like, there's an it, right? That and maybe that made sense. I still disapprove of it pedagogically, but maybe it made sense at a time when there was like it seemed more like there was a way when Harlan Ellison said that, and presumably he was imagining that particular short stories in the prose, and then you get an agent, and then this that's called making it, like that's being a pro writer. And I feel like, first of all, the world has exploded so much that you might labor in obscurity writing novels for $500 advance, and then have one TikTok video that has you hanging out with Billie Eilish. You know what I mean? Like, who the hell knows anymore? A, and B, there isn't an it, and the it is not like some dollar number of writing sales per year, right? Like, because in some ways you could be miserable doing that, and you could be the sort of person who's going to be who could do that and would be miserable at it, or could have some other modified thing, or a day job, or be in a writer's room, or whatever, be delayed, whatever. Like, so in some sense, there's, we have some limited set of experience, and the other people who are going to come after us will. But the thing to have your eye on is, like a sustainable way in which the things that you do support each other, so that you have some constellation of things that, like, it ends up being a good writer's life. You know what I mean?
Well, and part of that, I think, is figuring out your goals. Like, when we interviewed Paolo Bacigalupi, and I was talking about Wind Up Girl and writing the other books, he said he was very deliberate. He wanted to be able to support his family as a writer. And so he made book choices, what am I going to work on based on that? I have never done that. Right? Like, that's never, no, it's like, right. That's never been at the forefront. Like, and if I had to, like, say, what do I want to do as a writer? Like, what drives what I write? There's a problem I'm trying to work out that I haven't seen addressed, or there's a community, there's something I want to say to the world that I think is important. Or I want to represent, like I just finished and turned in a cancer memoir. Like, I'm like, this is my experience. It's just witnessing. This is what it was like for me. Maybe this is informative, maybe it's helpful, maybe not. But and none of that is made with financial considerations, really. Like, it's always, I would always like to get paid. I'd love to be fabulously wealthy. And I do care about fame. I care about awards. I care about,
renown.
Being known. Well, and like, being known through the ages would be nice.
Right.
But there's also, you gotta have to, at some point, most of us are going to have to make our peace with the fact that that's not going to happen. Entropy is running. No, entropy is running.
No, I know. We will eventually the sun will eat the earth.
Yeah. nothing is forever, right? So then how do you, so my point there is
eventually the sun will even reach the giant plaque set up for me in the Oort cloud.
No. But what I'm trying to get to is that you have to figure out what sustains you as a writer.
Yes,
right?
What you want. I think that's a really good point. That what you want. I mean, and for instance, I mean, like when Harlan Ellison was being like that, you'll make it, you won't. You'll make it, you won't. Presumably, James Tiptree Jr. would not have made it by that standard. James Tiptree Jr. published like maybe 30 short stories and 2 novels, none of which sold widely. Like presumably, James Tiptree Jr. by the standard of like, will you make it as a commercial writer, is an abject failure. But people are sure as hell reading James Tiptree Jr. today in a way that I'm not sure they're reading Harlan Ellison. So so it's and there are other things that are like synergistic. Like, I mean, an example that comes to mind is the way that Corey is writing novels that very much support his active. You know what I mean? For a while, I mean, the period he's on the EFF and doing this kind of and they're like test cases for one another. Like Corey is somebody like Scalzi that seems like have this very well built system for like precisely what they wanted to achieve. Like in Scalzi's case, it was like making a living writing by recreating in a progressive modern way this particular joy from like the Heinlein, kind of novel. In Corey's case, there was like this even if, I mean, he made money on his novels, but even if he hadn't, they were like both test cases because he was creative commenting them, so they made a point in that way. Content-wise, they were like thought experiments that promoted this vision of the world that he was then following up with essays and activism and trying to change laws. So I mean, there was like the whole thing was synergistic to achieve what he was really driven by, right? And it's going to be different for everybody. What I mean.
It's really interesting thinking about that versus, say, Arundhati Roy, who wrote The God of Small Things, wild success, literary, but then she went and did political activism, which had nothing to do with her novel, right? Like it was clear that she kind of was like, okay, I did the thing, but this is what I actually care about, right? I'm going to spend
off my bucket list. And
I'm going to spend the rest of my life doing this, it's fascinating. I think, I guess one thing I'd like to kind of give them is, in the end, a lot of those things you want, there's going to be a lot of chance and luck involved in achieving them. You won't be able to control. You may get the movie deal, you may not. You may get, whatever. But so given that, what will actually be reliably satisfying for me anyway, I won't speak for everyone, is if I love the work I'm doing, right? And that's kind of where I want to come back to is how do you continue to find joy in the work?
Does it feed you? Yeah.
And
what you're doing both creatively in terms of writing and also like, do you engage in social media? Do you go to cons? Like that whole package of like, what kind of activities do you do? You want to run a Patreon? Do you want to self-publish? Do you know what I mean? Do you want to, like, those things are all like the answer is yes, if that's part of a ecosystem of your life that feeds you and is, you know what I mean? Like there's like anything that's like draining your energy. I mean, I'm not saying never do anything that drains your energy, because sometimes you want to push through to get somewhere for a purpose, but like you have to decide if it's sustainable. I think sustainable is really because I mean, maybe it's fine to burn some reserves in order to get over a hump. That's fine. But like, there isn't just one thing you're necessarily everyone's trying to do, and the thing you're trying to do has to align with, making you happy.
When we started this podcast, right? Like we didn't know, is this going to be sustainable for us or not? Like it sounded like a good idea, and then as it turns out, recording it makes me happy, right?
Totally.
So
it's rejuvenating. It's
right. Whereas
I don't know what our listeners think, but we're having a good time.
We're having a good time. And it turns out editing, at the beginning I thought maybe I'll be doing a bunch of the editing. No, I have no
interest. That is very funny. I just had this conversation with on the way over here, and my daughter was like, I thought Marianne did all the editing, and I was like, yes, that was the original pitch.
No.
As it turns out, I'm much more interested. Originally I was like, look, I'm willing to do this, but I'm just show up, record. I don't have any room for any other, as it turns out. And you were like, it's fine, I got it. And as it turns out, I end up
I really
listening
don't want
to the podcast while folding laundry. And anyway, but I really like what you said about what's chance and what's under your control. And I mean, that is I think if you say sustainable writing practice, which is one in which even if all the odds fail you, you know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? You're still nourished by it, right? Like,
Right.
even if in fact you never, I don't know, like none of the things, well, that's always relative, because whatever
Yeah.
stage you reach, it still feels like you haven't reached the next one. So, but like, given that you will, so maybe it's better to say, given that you will always be in a position where some things will
Yeah.
work out and other things won't, right?
Yeah.
Like
And I do think
that
that's,
I
do think it's important, like what you just said. Like I recently saw a friend of mine, um, and who I hadn't seen in a while, a writer friend, and he had won some awards in the interim. And I was like, "You must feel so good." And he was like, "Actually, no, I felt worse after winning the awards, because it was immediately the sort of like, what have you done for me lately? And like, now the next thing." And like, that did not, like, winning the award did not fix everything.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing, the things that you think are nourishing may not in fact be nourishing, right? Like, in fact, it's stressful to like get attention in some ways. Like, there's some ways in which when the eye of the world turns on you and you're getting all this attention, it can be like kind of, it's great in a way. You're like, yay, this is what I was trying to accomplish, but it can also kind of suck. Like, it raises the pressure, it raises stakes, you may choke up. And like, I don't know, to some extent, when the eye of Sauron turns away and you're just like laboring in obscurity, like, I often find I'm happier. Like, you know what I mean? I'm like, that, like I got a lot of like nominations and stuff in the early 2000s, and then I started working on a novel, and I was like, which took like 10 years, and like nothing was happening. And sometimes I was sort of lonely, and I'd get nervous, and I'd be like, is anybody, like, have you forgotten me? But like, in another way, it's like, then the novel came out and I'm trying to promote it and whatever. And it's like, those times are like, I kind of cherish when like nobody's paying any attention at all.
And you're just working.
I just get to write.
Like, no, I was talking to,
rather than running after the shiny,
I talked to, at some point, I was talking to George R. R. Martin, and I said, you must love the fame and fortune, or, and he was like, the fortune is great. I could do without
fame,
the fame.
Not so much.
Right?
I've heard that too.
I feel like
the funny thing that writers want is fame for Ted was saying this on the podcast episode with him, is that, he generalized this to writers. I don't know if it's true for writers in general, but he was like, he basically, I think it's a common situation. He's like, I'd love the words to be famous. I don't actually want anyone to pay attention to me. Like, why are you looking over here? I wrote that. Go look at that. You know what I mean?
Well, I'm a Leo. I want people to pay attention to me, but as well as the words. But
I'm a half Leo, so
I do feel like the poets I know, most of them have had to confront this much earlier, right? And like, just sort of realize, like, maybe I can win awards. Maybe, I can be known in my community, but I'm never going to be famous, right? I'm never going to be actually famous. I'm never, and even my husband, even Kevin, right? He's a theoretical mathematician. He is one of the best in the world, right? Like, he was of the group that at one point was like, maybe he's going to win a Fields Medal, and then he didn't, and had to deal with that. But even if he had, he wouldn't have been a household name. He's not going to be Oprah. Nobody's going to know who the winner of the Fields Medal is. Right?
Now I love the idea of the winner of the Fields Medal going on Oprah. Like that.
That would be fabulous. But this is the thing, right? Like, even if you have fame, it's probably in a small group for a short duration. And the poets are like, well, there's never going to be any fortune. And
or in the case of mathematicians, it might be a small ring or a small class.
Yeah,
that was a combinatorics joke.
Was it
slightly above my head? Yeah, I don't actually know what I'm saying. I just think Kevin. I don't know what joke I just made, but I feel like Kevin will get it.
Yeah. I could have thrown in something about trees, but anyway. I usually, when I try to explain what he does, I'm like, okay, do you know what a Mobius strip is? And if they don't, then I show them a Mobius strip, and then we have a lot of fun with the Mobius strip, right?
And that distracts them from the question of what he does.
That's right. It works out really well. And if they do know that, then I was like, okay, how about a Klein bottle? And then if they know that, I'm like,
you show them one of those, and that's impressive.
And if they know both, then I can be like, okay, he does everything that comes after that. That's all I know, So.
Yes.
All right. Well, we're getting close to our 2-hour
close
mark.
To time.
Are there things that we didn't talk about that you definitely want to have in first week?
Well, I think we talked about most of the things. I do think that Oh, I have one other idea along the lines of like idea profligacy, and this may be hard to do the first week because they don't know each other, but maybe towards the end of the first week is what I would love to see. Um, I think one funny exercise, and this is something you could do in small groups, particularly if you had some mechanism for making the small groups not purely random, but like by preference, is that for people to pitch each other ideas, like a little mini version of the overcrit, which may be stupid first week because they don't know each other enough, but like to be like, you know, I think you should write this, because I like the idea of coming up with ideas and giving them away.
Maybe on like Friday or something,
Yeah,
like once
Friday.
they know each other a little bit.
Yes.
So no.
Or maybe it could be a little more like, but I like this idea of like training people that ideas are maybe right. It should be more like you pitch an idea and then somebody in the group is like, I want that one or whatever.
We'll have presumably we'll have a whiteboard, right? So we can throw tons of stuff up on the whiteboard and like
but I like the idea of people giving each other like Secret Santa for story ideas. That I don't know, like like the idea of, because I think that can be useful to break people out of the sense that they have to like carefully hoard and come up with the, I mean, of course, in general that doesn't work because ideas don't work for, you know what I mean? Like, but on the other hand, it may work as a stretch, right? So like like in a way, what you want at Clarion is to be trying out some of what you want is to try out things that you wouldn't necessarily.
Well, and I think it was Michael Bishop was my Clarion teacher week 1. Probably, where he kind of walked in, he's like, all right, this week you have to write a hard science fiction story. And like 3/4 of the room was like, right. But, but it was good for us.
Yeah.
It was, a fine thing to do for a week. So,
exactly. And exactly. So some of that, I also think that, another thing I wanted to say about the identity, circling back to the identity thing, is that there's your identity and then there's your obsession. Like, so that's another thing, is that like, because you mentioned, this occurred to me when you mentioned Elliot de Bedard writes lots of Vietnamese people in the future. Also, a whole lot of Aztecs. She's not an Aztec. She's just really interested in the Aztecs, and that's it equally. Like, I think having those 2 things,
sure.
It's like also, what are you obsessed with? That's what are you just, wake up at night thinking about? Like, that's another really interesting source to draw from. I mean, I think it, and I mean, of course, where if you're obsessed with something and it's also a real world thing that some other people are a part of, then we get into the writing of the other territory, and you should probably ask them before you publish anything. Sure. Yeah. But like, whatever it is, it could be Klein bottles, like in particular your obsessions that don't obviously fit, right? Because I mean, of course, if you're obsessed with hyperdrives, then you probably already put that in your science fiction and we don't need to talk about it. But like your obsessions that you don't necessarily think belong, like or that are too boring or too obvious or too weird or whatever it is, like that is an interesting place to work from, along with that. And I think that pairs well with the identity thing. Actually pick an aspect of your identity and something you're obsessed with that has nothing to do with your identity. Now write a story about those 2 things. Is a good exercise.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. All right. So I think we have a start.
I have one last thing to say about story ideation, which we've talked about in the podcast before, but I like to actually do it as an exercise, which is ways to begin, places to begin, like where generating ideas and where you begin. And I think it would be interesting to begin, because people begin in different ways, to begin from world building, from character, from language. Do you know what I mean? All of those are different ways in, right?
It's interesting.
So
I do a lot of from incident.
From incident?
Like something happens in the news, and then I think, okay, how do I translate this into my universe? How do I
get inside that? Yeah.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, I think that would be interesting to try and have people try out, because they're just at the beginning of this journey, like try out, like, so we could do a series of exercises where we come up with are
you taking notes on this? Okay, write this down so we don't have to recreate it.
Put it in the Slack.
Yeah.
Okay. So yes.
So Ben's going to take notes, and we're going to do all the things in Clarion, and bemoan the fact that we're only there for 1 week.
I know, right? Okay, so if you're listening and there's still time to apply, depending on when we publish this, and you want to do all these things with us, and then also like get all the other amazing people.
I should also say a lot of people apply to Clarion these days, and they have told us that they get far more qualified applicants than there is space for. And
no doubt. So it will be hard.
No, but the reason I'm saying what I want to say is two things. One is that if you don't get in, try not to take that as a,
Sure.
Like you're not good enough. That
Right.
It doesn't mean that, right? Like, there's just more spots.
It's always super subjective too. Like any submissions process, it's going to depend who reads your story and how they felt that day, and whether they got it, and so on. Right. So,
and then the other thing I want to say is that we are starting up this fall a whole bunch of writing things at the SLF, and so we're going to be talking more about that. And specifically, there's stuff you can do. I'm thinking of it as 3 tiers. And so we want to talk about this in more detail, but essentially stuff you can do on your own for free as an autodidact, kind of just working through. Stuff you can do in the traditional workshop model where you sign up for a course and you have instructors and so on. But then in between that, I'm really excited about the cohort model where we have a mentor, and we did kind of a pilot version of this several years ago, but now I'd like to do one where we work through a series of modules with the cohort. And so it's just kind of like this hopefully affordable cross between being on your own and taking a full-on course. And so an intermediate position that I hope will be really accessible to people and useful to people. So fingers crossed.
In sum, if you're listening to this podcast and you'd like to hang out with me and Marianne and Kat Rambo and Samit Basu and Karen Lord and Arlie Song and Nora Jemison next summer, apply to Clarion West. And even if you miss that or it's too late or you don't get in, the SLF has your back, and you can sign up for the SLF.
We're developing some stuff, so we'll see how it goes. I have occasional dreams of like opening Clarion Chicago, but you're laughing like.
Well, I'm laughing happily. I'm laughing in recognition that this is not an un-Marianne thing to do.
That's right. So we'll see what happens. So if I could talk my university into it, that would be the first step. So, because that would give us housing. So in any case, so thank you, listeners. Darius has reminded us there's a whole bunch of stuff we're supposed to be saying at the end of these. So I'm going to say,
email us at mrahpodcast@speclit.org.
Follow us on Twitter, MRAH Podcast.
Then you can follow us and like us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, whatever. I don't know where we are.
Yeah, and giving us a good rating is super helpful if you liked it. So it makes it much more visible. That's really the main thing is right now it's visibility. So trying to let people know that we exist would be great.
Even if no one knows that we exist, we're going to still keep talking to each other.
Well, that's true because it is because this feeds us and it is sustainable.
It's nourishing. So you can subscribe or not. We don't really care.
I want the fame.
I exaggerate.
I exaggerate.
Right. We do care, but
But for emailing us, I'd love to hear more from people about like things that interested you. If you want to argue with us about the podcast, if there are things you'd like us to cover in the future, if there are guests you'd particularly like us to bring on, send us your suggestions. We'd love to hear them. So, all right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening. Hey, humans. Don't forget to follow, like, and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and more so that you don't miss future episodes of Mohenraj and Rosenbaum Are Humans. Leaving us a good rating also helps us reach a wider audience. Engage with us on Twitter at MRAH Podcast and check out our weekly clips of episodes. If you want to reach us directly to ask questions or continue the conversation, you can email us at mrahpodcast@speclit.org.
This podcast is hosted by Marianne Mohenraj and Benjamin Rosenbaum. Editing and show notes by Darius Vinisar. Music composed by Thor Bremer. And cover art by Stephanie Bailey. Thanks for tuning in to Mohenraj and Rosenbaum Are Humans.